Since mid-June, we have been reading from the stories of our foreparents in the Hebrew Bible and the book of Genesis. The stories of Sarah and Hagar and Abraham, of Rebekah and Isaac and Ishmael, and soon Leah and Zilpah and Bilhah and Rachel and Jacob and Esau. That is one complicated family tree, and noticeably more women than men. But like the parable of the sower that we heard last week, I think I've heard these stories so many times that I hardly pay attention to them anymore. They're like the stories we repeat over and over again in my family. One of them is called the story of the great Thorntown gorilla. I'll tell you that one someday. But it's one of those stories where I just hear the first line and then say, yeah, I remember, and then zone out. Maybe I should try again. Last week's first reading about one of our foremothers really caught my attention. If you remember, it was about Rebekah, who was married to Isaac, when she was pregnant with her twin sons. And while she was pregnant, those boys were struggling within her and made her so miserable, she cried out to God for relief. But even when she finally had those two sons, they continued to struggle with one another, straight from birth and all the way into adulthood. In today's first reading about one of those sons, Jacob, we hear about his vision of God on his way to wherever he was going, but what we don't tell in the story is why he was on the road. He was on the run because he had stolen his father's blessing from his brother Esau. And if Esau caught him, he likely would have killed him, and we would have had Cain and Abel all over again. So Rebekah, who helped Jacob steal that blessing, gave him a traveling bag and said, "Hit the road, son." What's striking to me about all these stories we've been hearing, all of them, is that from the beginning, they all seem to have some kind of conflict at their heart. We read about a story of conflict between Sarah and Hagar over whose son would be favored. And eventually, the conflict resulted in Hagar being thrown out of the camp. Later, we heard about Abraham's conflict within himself, and even with God, over God's command to sacrifice Isaac. Luckily, that resolved in a different way. There's clearly some conflict going on between Isaac and Rebekah over which of their sons to favor. Isaac's favorite son was Esau. Rebekah's favorite son was Jacob. And now we have that conflict between Jacob and Esau that's gone so far that Jacob's in danger of death and his brother Esau's on the edge of killing him. And that's just the beginning of the story. We're only halfway there. There's so much more conflict yet to come. Talk about a complicated family tree. Or is it really? And I'm just asking that because it seems to me that sibling rivalry and relationship trouble and even competition and a little bit of deception within families is hardly restricted to the stories of the Hebrew Bible. I don't think I'm speaking out of school if I say I have a family in which sometimes things like that happen. Perhaps we do. Conflict is a part of our family lives. Which makes today's story all the more interesting to me. Because Jacob, who's on the run from Esau, who is alone and in real danger, has a profound experience of God when he's most vulnerable, on his way and in flight. In that time, he has the most profound experience of God's presence, a God who promises something completely startling and unbelievable, that from all this wound up conflict and complicated family tree, God is going to draw forth a nation that will be a blessing not only to its family and its offspring, but to all the earth. It turns out that even in conflict, or perhaps through conflict, God is still working that divine purpose out. Or at least God can still work that purpose out even in conflict. Now, I'm not proposing that we engage in conflict so we might experience God's promises. But would we have to try? Conflict is not only a part of our everyday lives, it's the order of our day right now. Conflict over how to respond to a pandemic. Conflict over our country's history of racism and its present manifestations. Conflict over who should be leading our country and how they should lead it. Conflict is with us. And in the middle of it, I don't know about you, but it can be hard to see the way forward. What do we do? You know, one might hope that Jesus' parable today, a story that also came out of a time of conflict, might help. But I think, if anything, it makes it even more challenging because it counsels us to wait for things to reveal themselves, for things to become clear. But what our translation of this story of Jesus doesn't make very clear is that the weeds in the story are indistinguishable from the wheat until it produces seeds. It's called sheet wheat, and when it grows, it looks just like all the other wheat around it. That weed is the perfect mimic of the actual wheat that feeds people. Those poor servants wouldn't know which plant to pull out, even if they were permitted to do it. Which leaves us with a kind of conundrum. God can and does reveal the divine work in times of conflict, whether in our family or our community or our country or our world. And it can be very difficult indeed to know what to do when we're in it. There is a certain amount of time that has to pass, sometimes very difficult time, before we can distinguish what is weed, what is wheat, what is nourishing from what doesn't offer anything. And like Rebecca, we must wait for the birth of whatever God is doing within us, and with her suffer the discomfort of holding that conflict within ourselves and in our relationships. We can't run away. If we imagine Rebecca herself as an image of God, God who surrounds and nourishes and creates us in her divine image over time, perhaps we can say that God, like Rebecca, is struggling right along with us. That doesn't mean we have to be idle when conflict comes, any more than Rebecca was idle as she waited for delivery. Being pregnant to me sounds like a lot of work, but we just can't rush the birth. Even as those weeds and wheat grew together, they still needed water and tending and preparation if they were going to produce any harvest at all. I think of our formation time today when we're going to reflect on race and racism as that kind of preparation. We may not know yet how we need to act, and yet, tilling our own souls for what is nourishing and what is not is good preparation for a harvest of new justice that I know God wants to give us. Maybe with Jacob, we can also dare to be open to God's presence in the midst of all of it. Like Jacob, we may discover a new holy place and a new promise we never expected. Still, that leaves us with the everyday conflicts we experience, and sometimes they never seem to come to resolution. I presume that the antics of our foreparents are not exactly available to us. At least, we probably can't get away with stealing each other's birthrights or inheritance or practicing deception so we can get a blessing. I have been encouraged this week, though, by a line from the response to the first reading that Chris chanted for us, from the Wisdom of Solomon, one of the lines at the end. Through such works, you have taught your people that the righteous must be kind. Conflict may be an unavoidable reality, but how much more might it produce in new relationships, in justice, in understanding, if kindness shaped the course of conflict? I can think of no better remedy than kindness to smooth the way as we await our own vision of what God has in store for us.